for having me. As mentioned before by Michael, actually, right now I'm in Israel. So again, my name is Hagay Levy. I'm the founder and CEO of Iluria. Iluria is a digital health company focusing on remote patient monitoring for mental and behavioral health disorders, such as anxiety and depression. And the first disorder that we are starting with is ADHD. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, ADHD is a chronic disorder with short-term implications of inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity, and some pretty severe long-term implications if not properly treated. Please meet Elad. Elad is my now 10-year-old son. He was diagnosed with ADHD at a very, very young age. And it was almost impossible for us to manage his treatment as we could never assess whether the medical treatment is effective or not. And Elad is not alone. 1 in 10 kids, and roughly speaking, 1 in 20 adults are diagnosed with ADHD, and their treatment processes are almost completely trial and error based. And the reason for that is that after the initial diagnosis, start a never-ending calibration of the medical treatment as our physiology is changing. And this stage is completely trial and error based, using manual subjective questionnaires, same as it was 20, 30, 40 years ago, with some very poor implications, not only poor clinical implications, but also enormous costs, which results from this back and forth, volatile and labor-intensive process. And this is the gap that we're trying to close, initially for ADHD, as I mentioned. We're developing a decision support solution which will streamline the entire process. And the basic idea is to analyze changes in physiological markers. The system, which is a software, basically retrieves physiological markers from any smart commercial device, any Apple Watch, any Fitbit. And then we mathematically analyze changes in these markers to deliver analysis reports to the different stakeholders. We completed 2 clinical trials, one in Israel, obviously, and the second one, which we actually completed a month ago. We've done it in the States with the Cincinnati Children's, and we are starting some scale-up processes in Europe as well. But just to close up the product side, I will present you with the old versus the new. So as I mentioned, the current method is completely manual, completely subjective, and very, very costly, whereas in the new approach, we can consistently deliver a objective analysis in many different layers, starting from the daily patterns. We're basically creating, so to speak, proxy pharmacokinetic scales, but again, we're doing it automatically and personally. And then some more aggregated data, what happens before or after we titrated, ongoing patterns, and basically completely eliminating the trial and error element in the monitoring process. A few words about the business. We are targeting the large institutional players. This slide is a bit US oriented, but basically the value proposition is like identical, with not only better caregiving, but also immense cost reduction, mostly in the sense of the labor. There are various other very relevant stakeholders, starting from the parents, which are always the focal point in ADHD, and actually as the lowest hanging fruit, we will approach them by leveraging the reach of some platforms we are collaborating with. There are some other very important stakeholders, obviously the pharma and some others, but it's a bit too early to elaborate on them yet. The total addressable market is quite large, taking into consideration the prevalence, the cost reduction, and the estimated price point. Again, we're not in production yet. To close the presentation, I will show our current status. Again, we are an early stage company. But together with that, we've done a very, very long kickoff phase with lots of validations. I mentioned the 2 clinical trials that we completed. We also secured the IP. I mentioned ADHD, anxiety, and depression. We got dilutive and non-dilutive funding. And actually next week, hopefully we will complete the seed round, which will allow us to deliver an initial working solution in like a year, to not only facilitate the next scale-up, clinical scale-up processes that I mentioned before, but also to get into production, again, initially as a B2B2C, while approaching the parents directly. And we hope to actually be in production for a B2B commercialization in like 2.5 years. A few words about the team. We are still a very small team because we're still bootstrapping, at least for now. But in the internal team, we have many, many years of experience, mostly in medium-sized companies that afterwards exited. And in the external team, we have assistance from not only physicians and computational biology experts, but from all of the different providers and other stakeholders that we are partnering with. As I told you, we are just completing the seed round and starting to work on the next round. But the overall goal is to be in production in the next year and to facilitate the clinical scale-ups in Europe and in the States and hopefully in other territories. Thank you so much for listening.
Thanks for the presentation. Very nice and succinct. Really appreciate that. First question, Elliot, if you want to unmute yourself, go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Hagay. That was a great presentation. I'm just curious in terms of the model you reported or that you showed on your slide. What sort of data goes into measuring the effectiveness of the intervention? Like, are there objective like clinical measures you can use? I admittedly don't know much about these types of issues, but like, is it self-reported things or objective ones? Thanks.
Yeah, so this is actually the most important question, because our task is pretty intriguing to train models to automatically analyze something which by nature is so blurry and so volatile and so subjective. So we are basically training algorithms to analyze changes in physiological markers, such as heart rate, HRV, IBI, respiratory rate. There are many markers already clinically associated with ADHD. And we are basically training the algorithms to analyze the changes in these markers and deliver analysis that basically mimics the gold standard, which is the DSM-5. The current gold standard is basically using questionnaires, either self-reporting or reporting by teachers or parents. And again, it's very roughly speaking, because we don't have the time to elaborate on that. We are basically mimicking the gold standards. Like in the clinical trials, we basically train the algorithms to mimic the questionnaires. And in Cincinnati Children's, we're basically train the algorithm to mimic the questionnaires like throughout the day to create curves. So it's like measuring something which is non-invasive to mimic something which is basically the gold standard, which is currently the questionnaires.
Great, thank you so much.
All right, thanks, Elliot. That's the last question I see in the chat. Thank you very much for the presentation. If you have any more questions or contacts to reach Iluria afterwards, please reach out to him directly. Thank you very much for today.
Thank you.
All right, next up is Ron Mills, CEO from Tivasol. Ron, if you want to unmute yourself and share your screen, the time is yours. Go for it.
I'll just try and get Ron on here. Sorry about this. One more second here. Just looking for Ron. Thanks, Rob. I know you. And Ron Mills is up next. Just looking for your screen. Is Ron here? If not, we can have some more questions for Iluria. I apologize for this. Ron Mills from Tivasol was going to present, and we might try and slot him in later if he is able to make it later. We didn't have that much time for questions, so I'm wondering, Iluria, you've presented twice, which is great. You presented last time. Just wondering what this time is the most useful. You've asked for contracts, funding, industry links, regulatory advice. What's the most critical thing for you to get over the next hurdle for your company?
So I'll push the funding element aside, because for startups, funding is always the most crucial element. Again, we're just securing the seed round finally. Hopefully we'll do it next week, but we are already starting working on the A round. But pushing it aside, I think the most important element for us is the product market fit. And looking at the Canadian market, which actually resembles in some elements the Israeli market, in the sense of like the centralized approach. We know that we must have some solid partnerships in the market from both the clinicians, providers, or any other type of partnership to, first of all, initially solidify the product market fit, the business model, and then to validate how to actually approach the market and to leverage the reach of some local player. So again, pushing aside the funding, the most important element for us is to have the local partners / OEM / whatever type of partnership you would like to refer to it as.
Okay, thank you. Is there anything that you think that Edmonton or Alberta could provide you uniquely in your journey?
Again, I will visit the Canadian market as a whole. We're not too familiar with the current structure of the market, so any assistance from any region inside Canada will be very, very appreciated. Meaning in the sense of understanding not the value proposition, because the value proposition is pretty generic globally, but to actually learn about the specific attributes of the market, maybe the specific attributes of the region. Again, we're not too much familiar with it. And then to understand whether we can actually collaborate on your region and maybe specifically in your territory.
Sure. And what countries would you say or regions are most accessible to you? Like if you're looking for an early adopter market to get your product beta tested and see how much penetration you can have, what are you looking for in a market?
So obviously our resources will always be limited, and obviously the US is always maybe the largest market ever. As far as we've seen, and I'm pushing Israel aside because Israel is a tiny market, we think that the German market is actually a super interesting market, mostly because of the regulatory environment. I'm talking about the reimbursement environment, which is super receptive. You can basically be in production while working with physicians getting paid in a year. But again, it's cherry picking, because again, the value proposition is identical throughout the Western hemisphere, but we have to cherry pick the different territories. So I would say Germany, obviously the States, and hopefully Canada as well. Okay.
Anyone else who wants to ask a question is welcome to. In the meantime, we've got a few more minutes. Does anyone have a question? If you did get an investment, you're looking for about $3.2 million, I think. So what are you giving an investor who puts that kind of money in?
Obviously equity. Either SAFE, as mentioned before by the speakers, so obviously SAFE is the most logical vehicle at this stage. But the basic element is equity, obviously. It's not debt, we're an early stage venture, so there's no sense in doing some sort of a debt allocation, maybe convertible debt, but it's basically equity.
Great. And what kind of expertise are you looking for in your investment group?
Preferably local expertise on the business side. Again, solidifying the product market fit, maybe opening some doors, is the most important element. And we are not too strong on that. Again, maybe it makes sense because the global market is super fragmented in the sense of applying a business model and applying a go-to-market strategy. So I would say that the ideal investor, again, pushing aside pharma companies with their adherence problem, I'm talking about more of a common type of investors, is not only providing funding, but also assisting with not only establishing a valid business model, but also operating that business model.
Terrific. We've got some great experts here. I wonder if anybody wants to chip in. John Porter, you've been really helpful, for example, and a couple others. And Jennifer, you've also helped people recruit to grow firms. So I welcome any offers for advice for Iluria.
I would, if I could jump in here. Very nice to meet you, Hagay. I'd be interested in speaking with you a little bit further. Typically, we, from the HR perspective, when you're building out, you were talking about building out having somebody in place to build out the operations. We would be able to support from the HR aspect. So, looking at if you are going into a Series A, will that money be used to build out your team, hire those key people, your business development, and all of those key players. So I will be happy to connect with you after the call.
I will put my email in the chat, and I will be happy to take it.
That would be great, because I missed it at the end of the presentation.
Yeah, I just rushed through it. This is an ADHD discussion, so
yeah.
Slightly sporadic. I mean.
Thank you, Jennifer, and I will share the email addresses amongst this this group as well. In terms of your intellectual property strategy, is there anything that we can help with on that front?
So actually, we've done a PCT submission for ADHD, and actually it was accepted in the US already. We basically moved to the national phase, and now we're doing the cherry picking of basically Western Europe and Canada, obviously, and some other, China, India, but our initial market will be the Western countries. We have done a preliminary submission for anxiety and depression, as I mentioned, and it's not there yet. We haven't got the remarks yet. So obviously this is not done, and obviously we might get some assistance from that element. But we've been active on that area, so it's not as if this is a clean page and we have to start filling it in. Actually, that was the most basic element we did when we actually established the company. So